This is all that remained of the St. Francis Dam after its collapse in 1928. The failure of the dam unleashed a wave of water that devastated the Santa Clarita River Valley. But despite this, once the disaster was over, the remnants of the dam became a macabre tourist attraction. People visited from across the state, bringing picnics to enjoy on the steps of the Tombstone. This went on until the monolith was involved in one more fatal incident. 17-year-old Leroy Arthur Parker was clambering up the tombstone with his friends when one of them discovered a snake under a rock, and threw it jokingly in Parker's direction. This caused Parker to lose his balance and fall to his death. The ruins of the dam were dynamited later that year to prevent the structure from claiming any further victims. This is Juliana, a Great Dane who saved the lives of her owners not once, but twice. During World War II, a German incendiary bomb smashed through the roof of her home in London during an air raid, and would have burned down the building if Juliana hadn't squatted over the bomb and urinated out the fuse. As if that wasn't enough, 3 years later she was on scene when another fire began in her owner's shoe shop. Smelling smoke, she started barking and woke up the entire family, allowing them to escape with their lives. Juliana was awarded 2 Blue Cross medals for her bravery, and when this painting of her was auctioned in 2013, the auctioneer said of her, quite simply, "This was clearly a Great Dane with a great bladder." This is a safety coffin, a device that became prevalent during the 18th and 19th century. While designs varied, most safety coffins were intended to allow the occupant to signal to passers-by in the world above in the event that they were accidentally buried alive. At this point in history, it was far more difficult to determine whether someone was dead or merely profoundly unconscious. There are multiple accounts from this era of people being exhumed from their graves and found to have clawed at the inside of their coffin. While the veracity of these accounts is disputed, the mere idea of this terrifying fate was enough to prompt inventors in the 1800s to develop coffins with breathing tubes and signal bells. As ingenious as these might have been, though, they were hardly ever used, and there's no evidence that they ever saved anyone. This is Nicholas White, a man who got stuck in an elevator in New York for 41 hours. He had been returning to his 39th floor office after taking a quick cigarette break, and had nothing with him but a pack of indigestion tablets. When the elevator stopped between floors, he rang the alarm bell, hammered on the walls, and even pried the door open to shout for help. There was no response. It was late on a Friday night and the building was mostly empty. It would remain so all weekend. Mr. White had no choice but to wait. He had no way of knowing how long he'd been there, and no way of knowing if he would ever get out. Fortunately, after nearly 2 days battling claustrophobia, cold, and extreme dehydration, his plight was noticed by a security worker, and he was rescued. After a brief recovery, he returned to work, only to find a note from his co-workers lambasting him for skipping out on his overtime. This is a boiling vessel, or BV, a device that is often referred to as the single most important part of a British tank. It has just one function, to boil water, which is then used to make tea or heat up rations. While the ability to make a quick brew without setting foot outside might seem like a luxury, it's anything but. During World War II, many British tank battalions suffered devastating losses because of surprise attacks which were sprung when tank crews stepped out of the safety of their vehicles to make a cup of tea. In one engagement in 1944, 14 British tanks were destroyed in 15 minutes in this way, and numerous soldiers were slaughtered. When in enemy territory, having a kettle on board a tank isn't just nice. Instead, for hundreds of soldiers, being able to make a cup of tea inside their tank can be the difference between life and death. This is Harry Houdini, a master escapologist and magician who was known for his death-defying stunts and the strange way he ultimately lost his life. Throughout his career, Houdini often demonstrated that he could withstand extremely hard punches to the stomach. But things went wrong when one fan put this to the test. When meeting Houdini backstage after a show, J. Gordon Whitehead took the opportunity to strike the magician hard in the stomach before he could brace himself. Houdini later died of a ruptured appendix. It's debated whether the punch actually caused the rupture or whether Houdini was already ill and ignored the symptoms of appendicitis because he thought they were just the effects of the blow to his stomach. Either way, the life of a man who defied death many hundreds of times was ultimately ended by a simple punch to the gut. This is Brian Robson, a man who attempted to mail himself overseas. In 1965, Brian was living in Australia, but longed to return to his home country of Wales. Unable to afford the airfare, he had friends seal him inside a crate and send him via airmail. Unfortunately, his shipment was diverted. After 4 days, he ended up in a warehouse in Los Angeles. As well as being extremely cold, Brian's cramped position meant that he was short of breath and losing consciousness, with joints so swollen he couldn't move. When he was discovered, he was at first mistaken for a corpse. After a week recovering in hospital, he was shipped back to the UK by American authorities. His plan to get home had worked, but not in the way he intended, and that was probably for the best. If things had gone as planned, he would, without a doubt, have frozen to death while in transit. This is Tosomu Yamaguchi, a man who some consider to be both the luckiest and unluckiest man ever to have lived. Lucky because he survived the destruction of Hiroshima in 1945, despite being extremely close to the explosion. Unlucky because he then returned home to Nagasaki, which was also obliterated by an American atomic bomb just a few days later. When this second bomb fell, Yamaguchi was actually at work, heavily bandaged, describing to a skeptical supervisor his experience in Hiroshima. Despite being just 3 kilometers or 1.9 miles from ground zero, Yamaguchi also survived Nagasaki and went on to live to the age of 93. Understandably, he spent a significant portion of his time on Earth advocating for nuclear disarmament. These are lawn darts, oversized, weighted darts that were a popular toy in the 1960s. Kids would compete to see who could land their dart closest to a target on the ground, with the design of the darts meaning that they would naturally fall point down, hard enough to stick into grass or dirt. Since their invention, they've become notorious as a dangerous and even deadly toy. At the peak of their popularity, at least 3 children were killed in lawn dart accidents, and in America alone, more than 6,000 people had to attend hospital because of lawn dart injuries. From the end of the 1980s onwards, many countries outright banned the sale of lawn darts. They've since been replaced with less dangerous variations, including darts with blunt plastic tips, toys that, even when thrown completely carelessly, are unlikely to cost any child their life. This is the Pear of Anguish, a device that's commonly believed to be a medieval implement of torture. It would, supposedly, be closed tight into a shape that resembled a pear, and then inserted into the mouth, or other orifice, of the person to be tortured. A powerful mechanism on the inside would then cause it to spring open, resulting in a significant degree of pain and injury. The concept is horrifying enough to capture the imagination, but the truth is that we're not entirely sure what these devices were used for. There's actually no evidence of them being used for torture, and instead it's thought that they might have been used to stretch boots or gloves. The Pear of Anguish is just one example of how we tend to think of the medieval era as being rather more brutal and bloody than it actually was. This is Venetian ceruse, a type of makeup that was popular in the 16th century. Users would dissolve the material in water to make a thick paste that could be smeared on their skin. where it would conceal blemishes and lighten their skin. Queen Elizabeth I of England was rumoured to be an avid user, and is a good example of the look that many of the aristocracy of the time aspired to. Unfortunately, Venetian ceruse contained lead, a poisonous substance. Its use led to muscle paralysis, nausea, abdominal pain, organ damage, hair loss, peeling skin, and in extreme cases, even death. The side effects of ceruse were no secret though. They were common knowledge, but people still continued to use it as a cosmetic on a daily basis. They wanted to fit the beauty standards of the time, and in many cases were willing to risk their lives to do so. This is the product of the Iron Harvest, an event which takes place across vast swathes of the countryside in Belgium and France each year. As farmers plough their fields, they turn up huge quantities of unexploded ordnance, barbed wire, weaponry, and other material left over from the First World War. To give some idea of the scale of the problem, around 900,000 kilograms or 900 tons of unexploded ammunition is collected each year. And though most of it is extremely old and rusty, it is by no means safe to handle. Since 1945, more than 600 people have died in the course of disposing of this material, which includes unexploded shells, grenades, live bullets, and mustard gas canisters. The First World War is long since over, but even more than a century later, the shells fired during the conflict are still able to inflict casualties. This is an anglerfish, a type of fish found only in some of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, the high-pressure, completely lightless depths of the Atlantic and Antarctic Oceans. Their outsized heads, see-through teeth, and luminous lure at the tip of their dorsal spine make these creatures look rather nightmarish, but it's unlikely you'll ever encounter one. The deep ocean is a part of the planet that humans have barely even begun to explore. By some estimates, humans have seen less than 5% of the ocean, even though the ocean covers around 70% of the Earth's surface. The anglerfish is just one of hundreds of creatures that live in a world which, though relatively close to our own, is as inaccessible and hostile as the surface of an alien planet. This is Nagoro, a small village in the Aya Valley in Japan, the human population of which is vastly outnumbered by hundreds and hundreds of scarecrows. The straw-filled dolls can be found everywhere in the village, congregating in the school gymnasium, waiting at the bus stop, or working in the gardens of empty houses. Most were made by hand by one woman, Miss Tsukimi Ayano. She started making the scarecrows when the population of the village began to decline in 2002. Many scarecrows are, in fact, modelled after departed residents. Though they make the streets feel less empty, they haven't halted the decline of the village's human population. At last count, just 27 people remained, outnumbered 10-1 by their scarecrow counterparts. This is Gustave the Crocodile, an unusually large Nile crocodile that lives in the Ruzizi River in Burundi. He's rumoured to have killed as many as 300 people, although more conservative estimates state that he's killed no more than 60 over the course of many decades. Those who've had close encounters with him report that he's covered in scars, including bullet wounds from failed attempts to capture or kill him. Reptile hunter Patrice Fay spent several years tracking Gustave, and estimated that he was 9 meters or 30 feet in length, and likely at least 100 years old. Fay was able to obtain permission to capture Gustave alive, but despite a massive concerted effort, including building a crocodile trap of unprecedented size, he was unable to do so. Though now an elderly crocodile, by all accounts, Gustave remains very much alive. This is a box of magnetics. a children's construction toy that was among the most popular toys of the year in 2005. Each set contained a variety of plastic shapes with embedded magnets, as well as a number of ball bearings. By combining the two, kids could build some truly impressive geometric structures. Unfortunately, a manufacturing defect meant that in some sets, the magnets could be separated from the plastic pieces which contained them, after which they'd be small enough for children to swallow. Ingesting magnets is incredibly dangerous, as once inside the body, the magnetic pull between two magnets can cause blockages or perforations within the digestive tract. The defective magnetic sets were recalled in 2006, but not before one child had died and 26 more had been rushed to hospital for life-saving emergency surgery. This is Protect and Survive, a pamphlet that the UK government put together in 1980 to be distributed to every home in the country if nuclear war was imminent. It gives advice on how best to survive an attack. One section shows how to build a fallout shelter, and another how to dispose of a corpse should someone die after an attack. Some of the advice seems almost quaint given what we now know about nuclear weapons. For example, it advises readers to paint their windows white to reflect the heat of the blast. It's questionable whether Protect and Survive would have done much good in the event of a full-scale nuclear attack, or whether its purpose was simply to keep people calm by giving them something to do other than panic about the coming apocalypse. This is a hunger stone in the Elbe River in Europe. Hunger stones are boulders covered in carved messages that are only visible when the river is very low, for example during an extreme drought. Each stone bears a different message, but none of them are particularly positive. One stone simply says, "When you see me, weep." The stones were carved as far back as the 1600s during deadly droughts as a warning for the future. If the river ever ran low enough to reveal them, a serious water shortage and maybe even famine was on the horizon. Europe's water supply is now much more secure, but the stones do still make the odd appearance, most recently in 2018. As global temperatures increase, these dire warnings may well become a more common sight. This is a crow funeral, a type of behaviour for crows which, although fairly common, we don't fully understand. When a group, or murder, of crows spots a dead crow, they often gather around, cawing repeatedly. Sometimes just a few crows gather, but sometimes up to 70 are observed, perching on every available surface and calling repeatedly for around 20 minutes until something causes them to disperse. It's impossible to know why exactly crows do this. Some claim that they are mourning or marking the passing of one of their own, while others speculate that they are gathering to try and learn what killed the unlucky bird, so that they can avoid this danger in the future. Whatever the reason, crow funerals remain an inexplicable but common sight. This is the Pirates of the Caribbean ride at Disneyland, California, a popular dark ride where guests float through a series of animatronic, pirate-themed scenes. On the way, they'll see several artificial skeletons in various poses. Today, of course, they're fakes, but when the ride opened in 1967, it contained real human remains. Imagineers at the time simply couldn't make realistic skeletons, and so instead acquired genuine ones from the University of California, Los Angeles Medical Center. These stayed in situ for a number of years, until they could be replaced with realistic-looking fakes. At this point, the skeletons were returned to their home countries for burial. The skeletons you see in the ride today are artificial, although some cast members do insist that there's still a real skull or two to be spotted if you know where to look. This is the Elephant's Foot, a huge blob of radioactive material in a room underneath reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. This nuclear power plant experienced a catastrophic meltdown in 1986, during which molten lava formed in the reactor core and flowed down through the building to a maintenance corridor. where it solidified into this distinctive elephant foot shape. When it was discovered 8 months after the disaster, scientists struggled to obtain a sample. It was too radioactive to approach, and too tough for a robot-mounted drill. In the end, they chipped off a fragment by shooting it with a Kalashnikov. Tests determined that 5 minutes in the presence of the foot would deliver a lethal dose of radiation. Over time, as the radioactive material within decays, the foot has become less deadly, but it will still be many decades before it can be considered safe. This is a Russian mountain, one of the earliest precursors to the modern-day roller coaster. As far back as the 16th century, it was a popular pastime in Russia to build steep wooden slides and then coat them with ice so that people could slide down. The first sleds were blocks of ice padded with straw, and sand was used at the base of the slope to help with deceleration. This was certainly necessary. Slides were as tall as 21 meters or 70 feet, and riders reached speeds of 80 kilometers or 50 miles per hour. Injuries were common, but this didn't detract from the popularity of these rides. The concept spread across Europe. In countries with warmer climates, ice sleds were replaced with wheeled carts. Eventually, rails were added to reduce the number of accidents, and slowly, over many years, something resembling the comparatively safe and sensible modern roller coaster emerged. This is a scene from Threads, a film made in 1984 that accurately depicted the effects of a nuclear war. The film followed the fates of several characters from the city of Sheffield in the north of England. It was brutally realistic, and has been referred to as the most terrifying film ever made. One critic wrote that, "It wasn't until I saw Threads that I found that something on screen could make me break out in a cold, shivering sweat." Using a documentary style, it shows the consequences of a nuclear blast, from the devastation of the initial explosion to the miserable and violent existence of those few who survive. Threads was made during the Cold War, when many believed nuclear war could be imminent. It was taken by many who saw it as a dire warning against the use of such civilization-destroying weapons. This is a depiction of the Mad Hatter, a character from Lewis Carroll's book, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. In the story, the Hatter is a whimsical, eccentric, and unpredictable character, traits that were based off the behaviour of many real hat makers in the late 19th and early 20th century. People who worked in the manufacture of hats often behaved erratically, and frequently suffered from psychosis, irritability, memory loss, and uncontrollable twitches. This was a result of working with mercury, which was used to treat felt during the hat making process. Hat makers worked without protection, inhaling toxic mercury vapours on a daily basis. Many took the resultant symptoms as an unavoidable part of the job. It was so common for hat makers to suffer from mercury poisoning, in fact, that the phrase "mad as a hatter" was in common parlance. This is Ron Svaden, a man who began to suffer the symptoms of emphysema in 2010. Mr. Svaden, a lifelong smoker, was convinced that his difficulty breathing was down to lung cancer, but tests came back negative. Instead, when surgeons operated on the 75-year-old, they were astonished to find a pea seed sprouting inside his lung. It had grown to almost 1.25 centimeters or half an inch in length by the time it was removed. It was suggested that he had aspirated the seed while eating, and that, against all odds, it had sprouted in the dark, moist environment of his lung. Mr. Svaden was relieved to find that he did not have cancer, and remained cheerful throughout his treatment, even when the first meal he was allowed after surgery contained a serving of peas. This is the interior of the Cave of the Domes cavern in Grand Canyon National Park, the site of one of the shortest search and rescue operations ever conducted. When hiker Mark S. didn't return to his car in 1982, rangers deduced that he had set off to explore the cave. They set out to search the caverns for him, and found him within seconds of entering. Mark S had become lost less than 50 meters or 150 feet from the entrance when he dropped and broke his only flashlight. In the pitch darkness, he had been completely unable to find his way out, despite trying for 2 whole days. Less than a minute of walking and crawling separated him from the exit, but the total lack of light meant that, were he not rescued, Mark S would certainly have died in the cave. This is Grinyard Island, an uninhabited island off the coast of Scotland that was used for biological weapons testing in 1942. With World War II in progress, scientists wanted to test how viable anthrax might be as a biological weapon. 80 sheep were taken to the island and bombarded with anthrax spores. The sheep promptly died, and scientists were able to confirm that anthrax would indeed be extremely effective. The island remained uninhabitable for decades thereafter, until, in 1981, an unknown party sent soil collected from the island to a government conference, along with a demand that the island be decontaminated. A few years later, it was. Topsoil was removed and the island doused with formaldehyde. It's now safe to set foot on should anyone wish to, but is colloquially known as Anthrax Island, and receives very few visitors. This is the Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Lab, a toy released in 1950 which is now infamous for some of its more alarming contents. The most alarming inclusion was a sample of uranium ore sealed in a small glass jar. The set's instruction manual encouraged children to try experiments using the radioactive material, including playing a version of hide and seek where they could hide the sample, then hunt it down with a Geiger counter. If kept within the sealed jar, the uranium was relatively safe. Typical exposure was about as harmful as a day in the sun. If, however, a child were to go against the instruction manual and remove the radioactive material from its container, it would be considerably more dangerous. Fortunately, the kit was never popular, and it was taken off the market after a couple of years, with no recorded incidents. This is the guillotine, a device designed to carry out executions by beheading quickly and cleanly. At the height of its popularity, there was a great deal of debate about whether or not a person might remain conscious for a few seconds after being beheaded. During the French Revolution, when hundreds of executions took place, there was ample scope for experimentation. Condemned persons were asked to blink continuously for as long as possible after being decapitated. Anecdotal reports from the time record instances of beheaded heads blinking, looking around, moving their mouths as if trying to speak, and even blushing. Today, it is generally thought that these movements were just down to reflex nerve action, and not to lingering consciousness. Though whether awareness might linger for a scant few seconds after beheading is, of course, impossible to determine. This is Laika, one of the first animals to enter orbit in 1957 as part of the Soviet space program. Though she never knew it, she played a vital role in history, proving to scientists that the launch process was survivable. She remains an icon to this day, but her story is far from a happy one. Shortly after launch, the temperature control in her capsule failed and she passed away. The Soviet government initially hid her fate from the public, claiming that Laika was alive and well, and that she remained so until she was automatically euthanized as per the mission plan. The truth about her fate did eventually emerge, and some of those who'd worked with Laika expressed remorse about what they'd done. Scientist Oleg Gzenko later said, "The more time passes, the more I'm sorry about it." This is a crypt in the Catacombs of Paris. Like any major city, Paris sits atop a complex network of tunnels and underground spaces. Unlike other cities, however, under Paris are chambers containing the remains of more than 6 million people. During the 1700s, the graveyards of the city were beginning to overflow. A new place was needed to store the bones of the dead. Over the course of several years, a mineshaft and other existing tunnels were repurposed to store millions upon millions of skeletons. Today, some parts of these catacombs are open to tourists, while others are used for secret concerts and parties. Occasionally, a visitor to the catacombs will lose their flashlight or become lost, and wander for hours or even days before being rescued or stumbling upon an exit, no doubt grateful that they won't be joining the millions of dead beneath the streets of Paris.